Alright, so we've got the motors squared away, they're taped on, they're soldered, everything's good. So now what we're going to do is we are going to finish up kind of the sort of the basic connections for our power system, if you will. So all I mean is all we're going to do is take these wires that were provided, this negative and positive wire that was provided with the flight controller, and this XT60 connector, which is going to connect to our battery. Note on the side of the connector there is a positive on one side and a negative on the other side. And also the negative side is kind of the sort of pointy side, if you will, sort of the not flat side. And that's the side we're going to solder the black wire onto. Now, again, I've already soldered these, but we're going to solder them just pretty much the same way you solder anything else, in the sense that we are going to heat them up and add solder into these little sockets. And then we're going to pre-tin our wires, and then we're going to solder them together. So, and then we're also going to attach this capacitor once we've soldered the wires. So, first of all, let's get our XT60 in place. Now, I'm going to use this like clay, tacky, what do they call this? Office clay? It's stuff. It's like stuff that you use to stick things onto walls or something. I think it's called blue tack. Except this is not blue. I think blue tack is a brand or something. So I'm just going to kind of stick that down like so. To hold it in place. If you need to add some solder to the XT60, or like if it doesn't have any solder on it, you just heat it up. You just heat up this what is this even called? A tab, a pin, a port, some sort of this metal piece, and then just feed the solder right into there. You don't need to like totally fill it up with solder, but you want to have a good amount of solder so that there's plenty for the wire to really hold on to. We want a nice solid solder joint. There we go. So it's nice and shiny, nice and fresh, nice and shiny. Ow, that's hot. Ow. That happens sometimes. Sometimes you burn yourself. Try not to let that happen though. It's not very fun. Negative side here, and I'm just going to kind of like heat up the wire and the XT60, and I'm just going to connect it just like that. And the red one, we're going to do the same thing. Going to heat that up, and everything's moving around now. Okay, there we go. Nice amount of solder. Almost burned myself there again. You may notice in your flight controller kit, this little tab is that's extra. Don't worry about that. That's just an extra wire bundle in case you lose the other one. So your kit, I think, should come, or your flight controller kit should come with a nice piece of heat shrink tubing right here. So we're going to take the heat shrink tubing. We're going to take the heat shrink tubing and just slide it right over the top of these guys, and that's going to keep them from shorting out if something metal should touch both sides. And then I'm just going to take my handy dandy lighter here and just heat up the heat shrink tubing. It's nice and covered. If that doesn't work out for you, just take some electrical tape and wrap it around there. Electrical tape is not the best because it like leaves residue and stuff, but you know what? It'll get the job done, and I'll bet you won't notice the difference when you're flying around. Okay, now that we've soldered our XT60, the wires to our XT60, we're going to solder these wires right here to our flight, actually like that, right there to our, well, not our flight controller. This is actually our PDB ESC board, really, but you know, our stack. We're going to solder this to our stack right there. Your stack probably, well, not probably, it will not have any solder on here. So again, we're just going to tin the pads. This one already had some solder, but I'm going to add more, and I'm just going to rest my soldering iron on the pad, get it nice and hot, and then just feed the wire kind of into the pad right there. I don't want to leave it on there for like too long, you know, and I don't want to add too much solder, but you know, I think just don't go crazy, and you will be just fine. But you want it to look something like that, nice and shiny. Hopefully you can see that well. Nice shiny little blobs. Note that there is a positive on the left side and a minus on the right side, and so we want the black side on the right side and the positive side on the left side. I hope that was not confusing. In any case, you got to match up polarity, folks. Match up the polarity. This soldering iron tip that I'm using is kind of small, so it's really not like the best for larger wires like this, but it works. It just takes a little bit more time and stuff. So they are soldered on there, and if we need to add more solder we can, but right now we have a pretty good connection. And then we're going to do the same thing on this side. Just heat them up. Just press them in onto the pad. And notice I am resting, well, maybe you can't see it, but I'm resting my hands against the table here. So, you know, rest your hands against the table if you need to, whatever you need to do to kind of stay stable with this. So you might notice at this point, you might notice that in my originally when I built this to test it out, I had the wires running through here to the bottom, but what I'm going to try doing actually this time is just running the wires from right here, probably go into like a standoff, and then having the cable come out right here, so that way you can do top mount or bottom mount more easily, and you won't be like stuck one way or the other. So, you know, it doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to work, right? Look at that. So that's what it looks like. Now we're going to attach this capacitor, and in case you're wondering why, well, so this capacitor, basically what a capacitor does is it kind of soaks up voltage, and so you can kind of think of it as like shocks on your car. So when you hit like an electrical bump, it doesn't go straight to your flight controller. It sort of absorbs that voltage, that momentary spike in voltage. So anyway, but the point is, this board will work a lot better, and I think it actually has to, from what I hear from other people, it has to have this capacitor to really function as it should. So we're going to install this capacitor, and the way we're going to do it is we are going to solder, it right on top of our positive and negative battery lead connections. Now, on your capacitor, as it comes, you will notice that one little prong here, one little lead, or whatever this is called, I'm going to call it a prong. One little prong is longer than the other. Now the long prong is so I can't even say it without laughing right now. I don't know why. It's just a fun, silly thing to say. So you'll notice that the long prong is the positive prong, and the shorter one is the negative. And you can kind of remember that, like positive is more and negative is less, and less is shorter. In any case, what you're going to want to do, and what I like to do actually, is I just mark, I just use a Sharpie and mark which side is positive and which side is negative, positive, negative, on the capacitor, you know, just that way I don't have to think about it. So, and that's important also because what we're going to do is actually going to cut these to the same length, and then we're going so that we can solder them, you know, evenly on here. Now, this is kind of important. You don't want these two prongs to touch, because one is positive and one is negative. And if they do touch and there's an electrical voltage, well, I mean, if there's an electrical charge, I'm pretty sure bad things will happen. So just don't let that happen. We're going to add some solder to this guy. We're going to tin the tip on here, and again, you can cut this shorter. In fact, it's probably preferable to cut this as short as possible, but I'm pretty comfortable with the length that it has on here. Now you can either put heat shrink tubing over the prongs here, like individually if you have small heat shrink tubing, or what I'm probably going to do just to demonstrate is like put a piece of electrical tape over both prongs to insulate them. But not until after we solder. So anyway, that's a lot of talking. Let's actually get started on this thing. Just a little something to the ends here, okay? So beautiful. So again, keeping in mind which one's positive and which one is negative, because that's really important. Now we are going to solder them right on there. We have our nice hot soldering iron, and I am going to solder. I'm just going to kind of, you know, melt this onto there, nice and good. I don't need to like melt the whole iron. I don't need to melt the entire wire again. I just need to melt it enough so that this guy stays on. And then same with this one. So we're going to heat it up. I'm going to press it on there. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to take a little piece of electrical tape. Again, heat shrink tubing is way better if you have it, but you know what? I'm going to assume that you don't. And we could just kind of like wrap it, kind of like a little bit like that, and then just sort of like wrap it around. I mean, we still have the little ends that are sticking out, but we've secured a lot of the rest of this. All right, now we are ready to actually start soldering stuff onto our flight controller. And we may as well start with our camera, because it's a nice simple thing to attach, and it makes us feel good when we, you know, get something done. So we're going to attach our camera here. But first, what we need to do is, you will notice that your camera comes with like a big like wire bundle thing and a bunch of like, it's kind of confusing. So the important thing is this end with this little, it has this little, I mean, you could read the instructions and figure all this out, but it has this little connector right here. There's a little connector, and this is what connects to our little toggle button thing to adjust camera settings, okay, which is what we're going to be using. There may or may not be a way to make this camera be controlled through Betaflight, through stick commands. I'm not sure, and right now we're not going to get into it. But think about it for the future. But this is totally fine right now, because usually I just leave my camera alone once I set it. So in any case, sorry, I got distracted. The point is, this is the end that is going to attach to your camera. So you can see it fits nicely right in there. It does, I promise. And it fits right in there. That's your camera side. And what we're going to do is we are going to, right about halfway-ish, we're going to cut this wire bundle in half. And so really what we end up with, so we can just take this piece and set that aside. Don't throw it away, just set it aside. And then we end up with a nice ground signal and positive wire. And then of course we have our connector wire here, and you'll notice this like purplish looking wire. That is for voltage censoring, but that's only like, we're going to use that. This has built-in voltage censoring, so we don't need this cable, so this wire. So you could just snip it right off of the connector if you wanted to, but I'm not sure if I maybe would want to use it in the future, so I just kind of wrapped it around here and made sure that it's not going to short anything out or cause any sort of problems or anything like that. Let's take a closer look at our board here. On the front of our board, you will notice that there are these three pads. Right here we have cam, ground, and 5V, which is 5-volt ground and camera. And so the way that these are going to go is we're going from left to right. We're going to go red, black, yellow. And that's it. That's all we need to do for the camera. Okie dokie, let's get to soldering. All right, so now we're ready to solder this. I'm going to turn this sideways just so it's easier for me to solder. Now, this is the first part where we're really going to get into kind of the difficult, smaller soldering pad type stuff. So just take your time, be patient. Oh, and again, these pads have been pre-tinned. So I've just put a little bit of solder on there. Nothing special, just a little bit of solder on these pads right here, as well as the wires. And now I'm just going to attach them. There we go. Beautiful. Beautiful. Let's get that ground wire on there. Okay, ground wire coming up. And again, you can probably see the soldering iron tip shaking a bit because, well, it's pretty fine stuff. The most important thing here is you just want to be careful to not put too much solder on the pads and not smear the solder when onto the other pad when you are soldering the wire. So at this point, this is probably a good time to say more information time. So at this point, I just want to mention that if you have what's called a multimeter, which is an electrical device that lets you meter various things, which is why it's called a multimeter. If you have one that has a continuity feature, that is really good, and it could be extremely important, because if you have something short out, like two pads short out, they will just fry. And so what a continuity feature lets you do is it beeps when there's an electrical connection or an electrical path between 2 points. So in this case, we do not want an electrical connection between these pads. So the positive to negative pad, there's no connection. Positive to camera, there's no connection. Negative to camera, there's no connection. And camera to positive, there's no connection. That's what you want. Now, also notice, you can use this for all kinds of testing. So like right here, buzzer positive, and I do 5-volt positive over here, it beeps, because that means they're on the same electrical pathway. They're on the positive. Really nice to have. You can probably get one of these for very, very cheaply if you just get a really cheap one. But if you plan on doing more stuff with it, I really like this one. I don't know if it's the best or not or whatever, but if you have no idea what to buy, check out the Innova 332 model, and they probably have newer models or cheaper models by now. But that's a good starting point. Now let's solder another nice and simple thing. This is going to be our receiver, and you see your receiver, or if you're using this one, or probably any receiver that you have, comes with a little connection, and it's got these little 3 wires if it's using like some sort of serial protocol, S-bus or I-bus or something, but I don't want to confuse you anymore, so I'll just stop talking about that. But in any case, this one came with this connector here. This is like an actually like a servo type style connector, but I just chopped it off because we don't want this. We just want these 3 wires here. So we've stripped these wires and tinned them, and we can connect. Well, we don't even need to connect this here, but that's how it would connect. It would connect right in there. We'll do that in just a second. So let's set this aside. They also provided this nice little clear heat shrink tubing. We'll use that in just a little bit. Now, when we connect our receiver here, notice that these pads, we're going to use these pads down here. We have ground, 5 volt, and then we're going to use RX3 right here, RX3, which is going to correspond to UART3, but we'll talk all about that later. So ground, 5 volt, RX3, and that is how we want to connect our receiver, and the signal is going to go on the RX3. Pretty much always, like, you're going to have positive, negative, positive, and then your signal wire. That's just pretty much a general rule for all different kinds of electronical sort of things. We're going to start with our ground wire up here. Now you can see these pads actually kind of have like pins, or I mean they have holes in them, so you could actually just kind of insert the wire into the hole and just to make sure that it holds in place. So there we go. We've got our ground. Let's solder our positive on here. Again, being careful to not smear the solder from one pad to the other. So let's just get that guy nice and melted in there. So we've got a good connection on all of these. We can connect our receiver here, just connect that in place. But what we're going to do right now is we're going to take this heat shrink tubing that they provide, and we're going to slip it over the antennas, because that is one thing, is you don't want to mess up these antennas. And you want to make sure these antennas stay on, because it looks like these are directly soldered on, which might be a little bit trickier than just kind of a snap in place type of antenna. So we're going to attach the heat shrink tubing, and we want to get it so that this connector is under the tubing, because that will hold it in place. All right, there we go. That's our receiver. And I just want to take a quick second to point out that see this little bind button right there on the receiver right there? It says bind. It's a very teeny tiny little button, and you press it, and you can barely feel it being pressed because it is so tiny. But that is how we're going to bind our transmitter to this receiver, just so you know. Now let's hook up the video transmitter. This is the TX805 video transmitter, and you'll notice that there are several wires coming off of here. You'll see that there are these 2 separate black and red wires that used to be connected to this little connector. I have cut off the connector right there. Let me see, focus, there you go. I have cut off the connector because we don't need the connector. We're just going to directly solder this to the board. And then we have these other wires here. We have the smart wire. It says right there, smart. We have positive 5 volts, ground, and then video. So the positive 5 volts is this red wire, and we're not actually going to be using this because normally, or you could use this to power your camera, but I'm not going to use that. So what I'm going to do is kind of just wrap it around these other wires, and then just kind of tuck it in place, I guess, and make sure that there's not any wire, any exposed wire on the end here that could cause any kind of problems shorting stuff out or causing electrical issues. So I'm just going to kind of wrap that up, and then we're just going to be working with the black, yellow, and green wires. So we're going to take all these wires, we're going to strip off the ends, and then we're going to tin them, and we will be ready to solder them to the board. Now first we're going to start with the green wire here, and we're going to solder that to TX1 right there. We're going to solder that to TX1. And let me get my soldering iron here. All right, we're going to solder this green wire, the smart wire, or the audio wire, to our TX1. Now we're going to solder the yellow wire to the vid pad and the black wire to the ground pad right here. We're going to solder the yellow wire to the vid pad, just like that. And to actually power the video transmitter, we're going to solder to these pads right here, the VCC and the ground pad down here at the kind of the bottom of the flight controller. And I'm actually going to add a little bit more solder to these pads. Of course, you know, with all the pads, we want to tin the pads before we solder. So I'm going to add a little bit more solder to these guys. So I'm going to solder the red wire to the VCC pad right here. Let's heat that up. Let's let it melt in place. There we go. Now we're going to solder the black wire to the ground pad. Ground pad right there. Let's melt those all together. There we go. Just like that. So now we have our for our video transmitter, we have our video connection, which is actually, so this is coming in, this yellow wire is the video from our camera coming into our flight controller, and then it does stuff in the flight controller, and then it spits it back out with the OSD on it, and then it spits out the video to the video transmitter, and then the video transmitter is actually going to send it to our FPV goggles. And then we've got the ground wire for that, and then here with the green wire, this is soldered to TX1, which for future reference, just remember that TX1, and that's going to be UART1 in Betaflight, but we'll cover all of that. Don't you worry about a thing. And then we have our power wires, and this is going to actually be our battery voltage. So whatever voltage we have for our battery that's connected here is going to be what's coming out of these pads, which is powering our VTX, which is fine because this will take 7 to 24 volts. So that's we're going to be within that voltage range. In case I didn't mention it already, so the smart wire there, which would usually it would say like audio wire, the smart wire, that's going to allow us to do smart audio, and smart audio has really nothing to do with actually audio. What we're actually going to do is use this wire. This will allow us to change our video transmitter settings through the Betaflight OSD in our FPV goggles using stick commands on our transmitter. So this way we don't have to look at the little LED lights here and go pressing this button and try and figure out what's what, because that can be just kind of a pain and kind of confusing. So that's going to be really nice, a nice feature to have. You don't have to have it, but it's nice to have. Well, congratulations, my friend. You have just soldered everything in place. This is actually all that there really is as far as soldering goes, which is pretty sweet. So now we're just about ready to do an ops check, an operational check, a function check, make sure everything works. So what we're going to do, and because this is really the best time to check and make sure that everything works, so I'm going to plug in I'm going to get my camera here. I'm just going to plug it in, and you know, we don't really need to worry about putting anything, you know, together, like configuring anything yet. We just want to make sure that everything works right. You can get your multimeter and it's good practice to do a continuity check. We want to do a continuity check. So we're just going to touch our meter points to the ends of the battery lead, and there's no beep, so we are good to go. I got my battery here. Before I plug in the battery, what I want to do is actually just attach an antenna to the VTX. So I'm going to use this little extension that came with it, and you'll see it has this little connector on this one side, and we're just going to take that and pop it into this little socket right there, and it will just snap in place, and it can rotate. And then I'm going to take my antenna, because it's always good practice to have an antenna on your video transmitter. Honestly, I think the technology is getting better to where you really don't have to all the time, but it's good practice. So what I'm going to do is set that right there. Got everything hooked up. I'll take the lens cap off of my camera. We've got our battery here. I'm going to plug it in, and we're going to make sure everything works. The motors work, they're beeping. We have light here on our receiver. We have light here on our video transmitter. Let me get my goggles, Yeah, okay, that's working. All right, we got everything working, which is fantastic. So now what we can do is we can just basically kind of start putting everything together, packaging it up, getting the rest of our frame kind of put together now that we know that everything works and we shouldn't need to resolder anything aside from the motor wires, but that'll be okay because we got to check rotation direction. And so yeah, let's finish building this.